In 1934, the engineering world was hit by a mathematical tidal wave that almost nobody knew how to surf. At the time, if you were an electrical engineer working on motors or generators, you were basically a specialist in a very narrow silo. You had the guys who understood direct current machines, the folks who dealt with synchronous AC motors, and the experts in induction machines. To the casual observer, they all look like variations of the same thing. Coils of wire and spinning magnets, but mathematically, they were treated like entirely different species. Each one had its own nightmarish differential equations, its own bespoke theories, and its own special case rules. It was a fragmented, messy landscape. Then came Gabriel Kron, a Hungarian immigrant working for General Electric, who published a paper claiming that every single one of these machines was actually just a specific case of one primitive machine. He didn't just suggest they were similar, he used the same advanced geometry that Albert Einstein used for general relativity to prove they were identical in essence. He argued that the physical spinning of a motor's rotor could be mathematically frozen and treated as a stationary current path, something he described with the almost biological term metabolic. It was a geometric trick that promised to unify all of electrical engineering, but it was so radical and so difficult that it sparked a decades-long controversy that changed how we think about power and motion. Part 1. The Man Who Walked the World. To understand the sheer audacity of Gabriel Kron's work, you have to look at the man himself. Kron wasn't your typical corporate engineer. Born in Hungary at the turn of the century, he was a wanderer. After getting his degree in the US, he literally spent years trekking across the globe, walking through the South Pacific, Southeast Asia, and North Africa, carrying little more than a backpack and a deep obsession with the underlying unity of the universe. This wasn't a guy who just wanted to make a more efficient motor. He was looking for the universal language of physical systems. When he landed a job at General Electric in the early 1930s, he found a field that was drowning in complexity. Back then, designing a new type of power plant or a complex naval motor meant starting from scratch with hundreds of simultaneous equations. There was no grand unified theory of electrical machines. Kron's insight was that the physical complexity, the brushes, the slip rings, the winding patterns, was just a distraction. He realized that if he could find the right mathematical lens, all these machines would look the same. He turned to tensor analysis, a branch of mathematics that deals with things that stay the same even when you change your perspective. In the 1930s, engineers used algebra and basic calculus. Tensors were considered ivory tower math, used almost exclusively by high-level physicists like Einstein. But Kron saw that a motor was essentially a geometric object. He argued that instead of tracking every individual wire and rotation, we should look at the energy paths through the system. This led to him proposing the generalized machine or the primitive machine. Think of it as a master blueprint. By applying different mathematical transformations to this one primitive model, you could deform it into a DC motor, an induction motor, or a massive hydroelectric generator. It was like saying every dog breed is just a transformation of a single primitive wolf DNA. This was his great geometric trick. He moved the problem from the physical world of spinning iron and copper into the abstract world of multidimensional space. Part 2. The metabolic secret and the stationary rotor. Now let's talk about that metabolic current path, because this is where things get really weird and brilliant. In a standard motor, you have a rotor, the part that spins, and a stator, the part that stays still. If you're standing in the room, the rotor is obviously moving. The currents inside it are swirling around at thousands of RPMs. This motion is what makes the math so hard, because the electrical properties are constantly changing as the wires move through magnetic fields. Kron's trick was to change the frame of reference. He used a mathematical tool called a connection to shift the perspective from the stationary room to the rotating shaft. In this new coordinate system, the rotor isn't spinning at all. Instead, the space around it is moving. He argued that the current flowing through the spinning rotor behaves exactly like a current flowing through a stationary, fixed path, provided you account for the geometric warping caused by the rotation. He called this a metabolic path. Why metabolic? Well, Kron had this fascinating, almost mystical view of engineering. He saw the flow of electricity through a machine not just as a sequence of electrons, but as a dynamic process of energy transformation that mirrored biological systems. Just as your body takes in food and transforms it into motion while maintaining a stable structure, Kron's metabolic path took in electrical energy and transformed it into torque through a stable mathematical structure, even while the physical parts were screaming around in circles. He essentially de-spun the motor. By treating the spinning parts as stationary paths in a curved mathematical space, he could use the same equations for a motor that he used for a simple static circuit board. This was a massive breakthrough. It meant you didn't need to reinvent the wheel every time you changed the rotor speed or the winding configuration. You just changed the metric of the space. It's like how a map maker uses different projections to show a round Earth on a flat paper. The Earth stays the same, only the coordinates change. Kron showed that all electrical machines were just different projections of the same underlying physical reality. Part 3. Tearing the system apart. As you can imagine, the engineering establishment didn't exactly give Kron a standing ovation. In fact, many of them were baffled. They called his work obscure, unnecessarily complex, and even mathematical hocus pocus. There's a famous story about a meeting at GE where a senior engineer supposedly looked at Kron's tensor equations and said, "Gabriel, I don't know if this is genius or if you're just pulling our legs." But Kron wasn't deterred. He went even further. He developed a method called diacoptics, from the Greek word for tearing. The problem with his unified theory was that while it was elegant, the math for a massive power grid was still too big for the computers of the 1940s and 50s. Diacoptics was his solution. He proposed that you could tear a large, complex system into smaller, manageable pieces, solve those pieces individually using his geometric methods, and then sew them back together using tensors to handle the connections. This was, in many ways, the precursor to modern parallel computing and finite element analysis. He was essentially telling engineers to stop looking at the machine as a whole and start looking at it as a collection of interconnected geometric subspaces. This approach eventually won over the skeptics, not because they suddenly loved tensors, but because it worked. When the first digital computers arrived, Kron's tearing method was one of the only ways to actually model a large-scale electrical grid without the computer's memory exploding. He had created a bridge between the physical world of power plants and the abstract world of information theory. Part 4. The legacy of the unified machine. So where does this leave us today? Gabriel Kron passed away in 1968, but his geometric trick is baked into the DNA of modern power systems. If you use software today to simulate an electric vehicle's powertrain or to balance the load on a national power grid, you are using the descendants of Kron's tensor models. We don't always call them metabolic paths anymore. That term has mostly faded into the history books. But the principle of the generalized machine is still the gold standard in advanced motor control. We've also seen his influence spread far beyond electrical engineering. His idea that complex systems are just geometries in motion influenced the development of system theory, robotics, and even some branches of theoretical physics. He was one of the first people to realize that the stuff in a system, the copper, the iron, the wires, is often less important than the structure of the connections between them. He taught us that a motor isn't just a machine, it's a mathematical landscape. When you look at the sheer variety of electric motors today, from the tiny ones in your phone's haptic engine to the massive ones driving industrial ships, it's easy to see them as a chaotic jumble of different technologies. But thanks to Kron, we know that underneath that chaos is a beautiful, unified geometric order. He found the wolf DNA in every motor we build. It's a reminder that sometimes the best way to solve a physical problem isn't to build a better tool, but to find a better way of seeing. Kron saw a world where motion and stillness were just two ways of looking at the same path. And in doing so, he turned the noise of spinning machines into a single, elegant symphony of equations.
Imagine a squirrel cage induction motor spinning at high speed. Traditionally, we think of the copper bars on that rotor as fixed physical entities moving through space. But in 1949, Banesh Hoffmann published a paper in Reviews of Modern Physics titled Kron's Non-Riemannian Electrodynamics, which asks us to do something quite radical. He suggests we stop looking at the physical metal and instead imagine a continual metallic metabolism where the current paths remain stationary even as the rotor itself turns. It sounds like a philosophical abstraction, but it's actually a sophisticated mathematical trick that uses non-Riemannian geometry to simplify the chaotic equations of rotating machinery. Imagine a squirrel cage induction motor spinning at high speed. Traditionally, we think of the copper bars on that rotor as fixed physical entities moving through space. But in 1949, Banesh Hoffmann published a paper in Reviews of Modern Physics titled Kron's Non-Riemannian Electrodynamics, which asks us to do something quite radical. He suggests we stop looking at the physical metal and instead imagine a continual metallic metabolism where the current paths remain stationary even as the rotor itself turns. It sounds like a philosophical abstraction, but it's actually a sophisticated mathematical trick that uses non-Riemannian geometry to simplify the chaotic equations of rotating machinery.
It really is a shift in perspective. To understand why Hoffmann and Gabriel, the engineer whose work he was interpreting, went down this path, you have to look at the sheer complexity of electrical machine equations. In a standard setup, the inductances between the stator, the stationary part, and the rotor, the spinning part, are constantly changing. They're functions of the rotor's angle. For an engineer trying to calculate performance, have variables that fluctuate with every micro degree of rotation is a nightmare. Kron's insight was that if you could transform your frame of reference so that the current paths on the rotor appeared stationary, those fluctuating inductances would suddenly become constants.
So instead of chasing the physical bars around the circle, we define two virtual, mutually perpendicular coils that just sit there in space. But how do you justify that mathematically? If the metal is moving and the coils are stationary, aren't you essentially breaking the connection between the math and the physical reality of the machine?
That is exactly where the non-Riemannian part comes in. Hoffmann explains that Maxwell showed we can treat electrodynamical systems as dynamical systems using Lagrange's equations. You have coordinates for the mechanical position, like the rotor angle, and then you have electrical coordinates, which represent the total charge transported through the circuits. Together, these form a multidimensional space. In a standard physical description, this space is Riemannian. But when you perform the transformation to make those rotor coils stationary, you're using what's called a non-holonomic transformation. In this context, it means the transformation of the electrical differentials, the currents, depends on the mechanical position of the rotor, but you can't simply integrate those new differentials to get a new set of stationary charge coordinates. You have a set of new velocities, the currents and the stationary coils, but no corresponding position in the traditional sense. Because of this, the geometric space describing the motor's behavior is no longer purely Riemannian. It acquires a property called torsion. This is the non-Riemannian part of the title. The geometry of the math actually changes to accommodate the engineer's desire for constant coefficients.
It seems like a lot of heavy lifting just to avoid some trigonometry. Why go through the trouble of invoking torsion in non-Riemannian spaces just to get design constants?
Because it unifies everything. Before Kron, every type of motor, induction motors, synchronous motors, DC commutator machines, was treated as a separate special case with its own set of ad hoc equations. Kron realized that if you treat them all as different reference frames within this non-Riemannian geometry, you can use a single universal equation of motion to describe every single one of them. Hoffmann points out that this transformation allows us to treat a commutator, which physically switches connections as it spins, as a stationary metabolistic current path. The math doesn't care if the physical copper moves, it only cares about where the current is flowing at any given instant.
Let's look at the specific example Hoffmann uses, the squirrel cage induction motor. He describes it as having 4 degrees of freedom. You've got the stator coil and then these 2 virtual rotor coils. He mentions a metrical tensor that defines the system. In a standard Riemannian space, we'd expect this tensor to be symmetric and straightforward. What happens to it under this metabalistic view?
The metrical tensor, which in this case represents the inductances of the system, actually becomes simpler in the stationary frame. Hoffmann shows that if we assume the mutual inductance between coils varies with the cosine of the angle between them, which is a standard engineering approximation, then the transformation results in a tensor where all the entries are constants. For instance, he defines the stator inductance as L11 and the rotor inductances as L22 and L33. Even if there's a salient pole, an asymmetry in the magnetic field, the math handles it by making L22 and L33 unequal, but they remain constant. This is the holy grail for design. You can measure these constants once and then predict the motor's behavior under any load or speed.
But if we're using these stationary coils, we're not using the standard Lagrange equations anymore, are we?
Hoffmann mentions that if you just plug these constant values into the traditional Maxwell-Lagrange equations, you'd get the wrong answer. He says there's an additional term that appears.
Right, that's the catch. When you move to a non-holonomic frame, the standard derivative in the equation of motion has to be replaced by a covariant derivative. That includes a non-Riemannian connection. Specifically, a term involving the objects of torsion appears. In the equation for torque, this term represents the motional electromotive force, or the actual mechanical force generated by the currents. In the stationary frame, the physics that used to be hidden in the changing inductances is now explicitly pulled out into this geometric term. It's like the Coriolis force of the electrical world. It's not a real force in the sense of a new physical discovery, but a necessary correction because you chose to stand in a non-moving frame while the parts are actually spinning.
It's actually more essential there. In a DC motor with brushes, the brushes are physically fixed. They define a current path in space. As the rotor spins, different segments of the rotor winding pass under those brushes. From the external circuit, the current path is stationary. The metal is metabolizing through that path. Kron's non-Riemannian approach is the only mathematically rigorous way to handle that transition without getting bogged down in the discrete switching of every single commutator segment. It turns a discontinuous mechanical clicking process into a smooth, continuous geometric.
There's a section in the paper where Hoffmann discusses the cylinder condition. He notes that the inductances and resistances depend only on the mechanical coordinates, like the angle, and not on the electrical coordinates, the total charge. This seems to be the linchpin that allows the whole geometric interpretation to work.
Exactly. Because the electrical charge itself doesn't change the physical properties of the motor, ignoring things like saturation for a moment, the geometry of the space has a specific symmetry. It's a cylinder in the sense that if you move along the charge axis, the landscape of the inductances doesn't change. This symmetry is what allows us to project the complex n-dimensional motion down into something we can solve. Hoffmann is essentially bridge building here. He's taking Kron's engineering brilliance, which many physicists at the time found incomprehensible or unorthodox, and translating it into the language of differential geometry that a physicist like Einstein or a mathematician like Ricci would recognize.
It's interesting you mentioned the unorthodox nature of it. Kron was often criticized for his use of tensors, with some engineers saying it was overcomplicating things. But Hoffmann argues the opposite. He suggests that by using non-Riemannian dynamics, we're actually uncovering a deeper unity. He even mentions that these tensor ideas could apply to things beyond motors, like the hunting and stability of complex systems, or even equivalent circuits for partial differential equations in quantum physics.
Kron was thinking very big. He saw tensors not just as arrays of numbers, but as a way to interconnect systems. If you have a motor connected to a transmission line connected to a generator, Kron's method allows you to treat each as a subspace and then use tensor transformations to stitch them together into one giant geometric manifold. Hoffmann's paper was a crucial validation of this. He showed that if you accept the simplifying assumptions, like the cosine variation of mutual inductance, then the tensor transformation is not just a mathematical convenience, it is a legitimate transition between reference frames in a non-Euclidean space.
Let's look at the math of that transformation for a second. Hoffmann uses a matrix C to transform the velocities. He shows that the new metrical tensor is derived by multiplying the old one by this transformation matrix and its inverse. But since the transformation is non-holonomic, the connection, the way we measure how vectors change as they move through this space, isn't just the standard Christoffel symbol. It includes this gamma term, which is non-symmetric. That asymmetry is the torsion. Why is torsion the specific geometric feature that represents a rotating machine?
Torsion, in a very simplified sense, represents a twisting of the space. If you think about what a motor does, it's converting electrical energy into rotational torque. There's a fundamental twist involved in that energy conversion. In the Riemannian space of a simple mechanical system, the connection is symmetric because there's a certain kind of path independence. But in a rotating electrical machine, the coupling between the magnetic field and the mechanical rotation introduces a directional dependency. The non-holonomic nature of the brushes or the stationary rotor frame assumption essentially bends the coordinate system in a way that creates this geometric torsion. It's a beautiful example of how physics can be mapped onto the curvature and twist of an abstract mathematical space.
And yeah, despite this beauty, how much of this is actually used by engineers today? When a modern engineer designs a Tesla motor or a giant industrial turbine, are they thinking about non-Riemannian torsion?
In those exact terms, probably not. They use software that handles the heavy lifting. But the generalized machine theory that students learn in advanced electrical engineering is the direct descendant of Kron's work. The Parkes transformation, or the DU axis model, where we transform three-phase AC currents into two-axis DC-like quantities, is a specific, simplified case of the non-holonomic transformations Hoffmann is describing. Kron and Hoffmann provided the rigorous, high-level theoretical foundation for the shortcuts that every power systems engineer uses today. They proved that these shortcuts weren't just lucky guesses. They were grounded in the fundamental geometry of electrodynamics.
It strikes me that there is a parallel here to general relativity. Einstein showed that gravity isn't a force in the Newtonian sense, but a result of the curvature of space-time. Hoffmann is essentially saying that the forces in a motor, the torques and voltages, can be viewed as the geometry of a non-Riemannian space. It turns engineering into a branch of topology.
That's exactly how Hoffmann viewed it. He was a collaborator of Einstein, after all. He was deeply interested in the idea that physical laws are just expressions of geometry. By applying this to something as mundane as an induction motor, he showed that the same sophisticated tools used to describe the universe could be used to optimize a washing machine or a subway train. He mentions that while some might find the stationary metallic metabolism viewpoint artificial, it is often essential in more complicated situations. It's about choosing the right lens. Sometimes the most unnatural perspective, like seeing a spinning rotor as a stationary metabolizing path, is the only one that reveals the underlying simplicity of the system.
The paper ends by noting that Kron's work even extends to setting up equivalent circuits for the partial differential equations of classical and quantum physics. That's a massive leap from squirrel cage motors. It suggests that this interconnection theory is a universal language for any system where different parts interact.
It's the idea of tearing. Kron called it diacoptics. You take a massive, unsolvable system, tear it into small solvable pieces, and then use tensors to describe how they reconnect. Whether it's an electrical grid or a quantum wave function, the metabolic exchange of energy or information follows the same geometric rules. Hoffmann's 1949 review remains a landmark because it took these incredibly dense, almost prophetic ideas of Kron and anchored them in a clear illustrative example that any physicist could follow. It showed that the math of the motor is much deeper than just wires and magnets. It's a window into the non-Riemannian structure of the world.
The idea that our industrial world is quite literally spinning through non-Riemannian space is a fascinating takeaway. It's a reminder that even the most practical technologies are often built on a foundation of abstract, high-level thought that challenges our basic definitions of movement and identity.
Imagine you're trying to calculate the electricity flowing through an entire continent. You have thousands of power plants, millions of homes, and a web of wires so complex, it makes a spiderweb look like a straight line. In the 1950s, if you tried to solve that as one giant equation, the computers of the era would essentially melt. But then comes Gabriel Kron, a Hungarian-American engineer at General Electric who suggests something that sounds almost violent. He says we shouldn't try to solve the whole system. He says we should tear it apart. He called this technique diacoptics, and while it sounds like a forgotten relic of Cold War engineering, it's actually the secret DNA of the parallel computing world we live in today.
It is such a visceral term, isn't it? Diacoptics. Kron actually went to the philosophy department at Union College in Schenectady to find a word that captured the intensity of what he was doing. He settled on the Greek roots dia for through and kopto for to tear. It wasn't just a clever name, though. It was a radical shift in how we handle complexity. Before Kron, the standard approach was to look at a system as a single, unified entity. But Kron realized that if you can find the natural fault lines in a system, say the boundaries between different power companies, you can solve each piece independently and then, through a very specific mathematical glue, stitch those partial solutions back together to get the exact answer for the whole.
It sounds a bit like divide and conquer, which we hear about in computer science all the time. But there's a distinction here. Usually when we talk about breaking down a problem, we're talking about software or logic. Kron was talking about physical, massive networks. Is diacoptics just a fancy word for matrix partitioning, or is there something more profound happening under the hood?
That's actually the exact question that sparked a massive controversy in the engineering world back then. Many of Kron's contemporaries looked at his work and said, "This is just matrix partitioning with more jargon." But Kron insisted there was a fundamental difference. In standard partitioning, you're just slicing up a table of numbers. In diacoptics, you're looking at the topology, the physical structure of the system. Kron's method didn't just ignore the connections you tore, it accounted for them using what he called an intersection network. According to a review by Harvey Happ, who worked closely with Kron at GE, the genius was in how Kron treated these torn interconnections as a separate, smaller problem that could be solved to link all the other pieces back together. It's the difference between cutting a map into squares and cutting it along the actual mountain ranges and rivers that define the terrain.
So he was finding the natural seams, but why was it so controversial? You mentioned he was vilified in some circles. If he was solving problems that literally couldn't be solved otherwise, why weren't people throwing him a parade?
It was a mix of his personality and his math. Kron wasn't just an engineer, he was an intuitive thinker who used tools like tensor analysis and non-Riemannian geometry, stuff that in the 1930s and 40s was usually reserved for people like Einstein. In fact, Kron's 1934 paper on the dynamics of rotating machinery was so advanced it won the Montefiore Prize from the University of Liège. Yet American engineers often found his writing incomprehensible. Banesh Hoffmann, a mathematician who worked with Einstein, once wrote that Kron's work was often mocked as being needlessly complex or just for show. Engineers wanted simple plug-and-play formulas, and Kron was giving them multidimensional manifolds. He was speaking a language from 50 years in the future.
It's fascinating that he was using general relativity concepts to fix power grids. But let's look at the tearing itself. If I have a massive power grid and I tear it into 4 parts, I solve those 4 parts. Does that actually save time? Or am I just doing the same amount of work in a more complicated way?
Back in the 1950s, it was a massive win for memory management. Computers like the IBM 704 had very limited brain space. If you tried to load a 1,000-node system into it, the computer would run out of memory. By tearing the system, you could solve one small piece, save that answer, clear the memory, and then solve the next piece. It was essentially a way to trick a small computer into thinking it was a big one. But where it really shines, and why it's the foundation of modern simulation, is that those torn pieces can be solved at the exact same time. This is the birth of parallel processing. Instead of one computer working for 10 hours, you have 10 computers working for 1 hour.
So Kron essentially predicted the multi-core processor and the supercomputer cluster before they even existed. But if his method was so foundational, why don't we hear the name diacoptics more often? If I open a textbook on parallel computing today, am I going to see his name in the first chapter?
Usually no, and that's one of the great ironies of engineering history. Much of what Kron pioneered was rebranded. Today we call these techniques domain decomposition or substructuring in structural engineering. In the world of power systems, companies like ePri still use A-diacoptics. The A stands for actors, to simulate smart grids and microgrids. They use a framework called the actor model to handle the communication between those torn subcircuits. So the technique is alive and well, it just went into witness protection and changed its name to sound more modern and less Greek philosophy.
That feels like a common theme with pioneers who are ahead of their time. They're too weird for the present, so the future just absorbs their ideas and forgets the source. But Kron didn't just stop at power grids. Toward the end of his life, he started talking about something called a crystal computer. That sounds like something out of a sci-fi novel. Was he actually building a computer out of crystals?
Not literally, but the concept was just as wild. In the 1960s, Kron became obsessed with the idea of multidimensional wave automata. He envisioned a computer that didn't just process bits in a line, but processed crystals of information across multidimensional spaces. He believed that if you could map a system's topology into a higher dimensional polyhedron, you could solve incredibly complex problems, like fluid dynamics or even the physics of the universe, almost instantaneously by letting waves of information propagate through this mathematical crystal. His biographer, Philip Alger, mentioned that Kron saw this as his crowning achievement, but it was so far beyond the technology of the 60s that most people just thought he'd finally lost his grip on reality.
It's almost like he was trying to invent quantum computing or neural networks using the tools of a power engineer.
There's the sense that he saw a unifying theory of everything through the lens of circuits. He even wrote a paper on using electrical circuits to model the Schrödinger equation, didn't he?
He did. In 1945, he published Electric Circuit Model of the Schrödinger Equation in Physical Review. He argued that you could represent the fundamental equations of quantum mechanics using inductors and capacitors. To Kron, everything was a network. Whether it was a spinning generator, an atom, or a national economy, he believed they all followed the same topological laws. If you could tear them and understand the connections, you could master them. It's a very grand, almost architectural view of the universe. He wasn't just interested in the electricity, he was interested in the structure of reality itself.
I want to push back a little on the efficiency. If diacoptics is so great, why was there research in the 1960s, like the work by W.R. Spillers, that claimed tearing was actually less efficient than just using standard Gaussian elimination? If the tearing adds an extra step of gluing things back together, doesn't that extra math eventually eat up all the time you saved?
That's a very fair critique, and it gets to the heart of why Kron was so divisive. Spillers and others were looking at the raw number of additions and multiplications. On a single processor computer, they were often right. The quote-unquote overhead of managing the intersections could sometimes make the total calculation slower. But the math changes when you have 100 processors. In that scenario, the inefficient extra work of stitching the system together is a small price to pay for the ability to run 99% of the problem in parallel. Kron wasn't optimizing for the machines he had. He was optimizing for the machines we have now. He was thinking in terms of computational throughput before we even had a word for it.
It's the ultimate long game. He's designing a method for a world that doesn't have the hardware to support it yet. It makes me wonder about the tearing metaphor again. When we tear a system, we're essentially saying the boundaries matter as much as the pieces. In modern simulation software, the kind used to design airplanes or simulate weather, how much of Kron's DNA is still there?
It's everywhere, especially in what's called finite element analysis. When an engineer simulates how a bridge will react to a hurricane, they don't solve one equation for the whole bridge. They tear that bridge into millions of tiny elements, triangles or squares, solve the physics for each tiny piece, and then use the boundary conditions to link them. That is pure diacoptics. Every time you see a mesh in a 3D simulation or a video game, you're looking at a descendant of Kron's tearing. He taught us that global behavior emerges from local connections. If you understand how the tears communicate, you understand the whole.
It strikes me that Kron's life was a mirror of his work. He was this Hungarian immigrant who lived in Romania during the Depression, traveled the world on almost no money, and then ended up at General Electric in upstate New York. He was torn between different cultures and disciplines, engineering, math, and philosophy. Maybe that's why the idea of tearing resonated with him. He saw the world as pieces that needed a universal language to stay connected.
There's definitely a poetic symmetry there. He once described his work as universal engineering. He didn't want to be boxed in. His journals are filled with these incredibly dense, almost artistic diagrams of networks that look like mandalas. He was looking for an ontology of engineering, a way to prove that the laws of man-made machines were just a subset of the laws of nature. It's why he was so obsessed with tensors. They're mathematical objects that stay the same no matter how you look at them. They represent the underlying truth of a system, regardless of the coordinate system or the tears you make.
But for all that beauty, he died somewhat isolated in his ideas, right? He spent his last years at GE in the analytical engineering division, but many of his peers still viewed the crystal computer and his multi-dimensional theories as eccentricities. It feels like he was a man who lived his whole life on an intersection network, caught between the world that was and the world that was coming.
That's a perfect way to put it. He died in 1968, just a few years before the microprocessor revolution really took off. If he had lived another 20 years, he would have seen his tearing method become the standard for every supercomputer on the planet. He was the architect of the bridge, but he didn't get to see the traffic. But today, if you look at the source code of high-end power simulators like OpenDSS, you'll see his footprint. You'll see references to Kron reduction and diacoptics. He's the silent ghost in the machine.
It's a reminder that sometimes the most important techniques aren't the ones that get the most headlines. They're the ones that become so fundamental that we stop noticing them. We've gone from tearing physical networks on paper to tearing virtual ones in the cloud. But the principle that the whole is a conversation between its parts remains the same. Gabriel Kron might have been a vilified figure in his day, but his method of tearing is what keeps the lights on and the simulations running in the 21st century. It's a testament to the power of thinking across boundaries, even if you have to tear a few things down to see them clearly.
And perhaps the lesson for us is to not be so quick to dismiss the needlessly complex ideas of today. The things we find incomprehensible now might just be the tearing methods of the future, waiting for the hardware to catch up. Kron was a pioneer who refused to simplify the world just to make it more comfortable for his peers, and that's exactly why his work endured.
It's a legacy of complexity that we're still unraveling. If you found this dive into the science of tearing as fascinating as we did, please share this episode with someone who loves a good story about the forgotten giants of technology.
Before our laptops had 4, 8, or 16 cores working in parallel, before the cloud could crunch petabytes of data by spreading it across thousands of servers, there was a radical idea born from the gritty reality of early 20th century electrical engineering. It was called diacoptics. It's the story of how we learned to tear massive, impossible problems into simultaneous, solvable chunks. And it all started with a man named Gabriel Kron, who quite literally walked across the world to find the math he needed. Before our laptops had 4, 8, or 16 cores working in parallel, before the cloud could crunch petabytes of data by spreading it across thousands of servers, there was a radical idea born from the gritty reality of early 20th electrical engineering. It was called diacoptics. It's the story of how we learned to tear massive, impossible problems into simultaneous, solvable chunks. And it all started with a man named Gabriel Kron, who quite literally walked across the world to find the math he needed.
It's a fascinating origin story because diacoptics isn't just a mathematical trick. It's a philosophy of decomposition. The term itself was coined by Philip Stanley, a philosophy professor at Union College, specifically for Gabriel Kron. It comes from the Greek kopto, meaning to break or tear, and dia, meaning through. Kron was an electrical engineer at General Electric, and in the 1930s and 40s, he was facing a crisis. The power systems he was designing were becoming too complex for any existing machine or human to solve as a single unit.
When you say complex, what are we talking about? This is way before the digital revolution, so were they just hitting a wall with pen and paper calculations?
Exactly. They were using AC network analyzers, these massive room-sized analog computers that used actual physical coils and capacitors to mimic a power grid. If you wanted to simulate a new power plant joining a grid, you had to physically wire it up. But as grids grew, the equations governing them, Kirchhoff's laws essentially, became a tangled mess of thousands of variables. Solving them meant inverting massive matrices, which, at the time, was computationally suicidal. If you made one tiny error in a 100-variable matrix, the whole thing was garbage. Kron's insight was, why solve the whole thing at once?
So the tearing is literal. He wanted to physically and mathematically rip the grid into pieces, solve those pieces, and then somehow stitch them back together.
That's precisely it. He called it the method of tearing. But the genius and the controversy was how he stitched it back together. According to historical records from the IEEE, Kron didn't just use standard algebra. He used tensor analysis and non-Riemannian geometry, concepts usually reserved for Einstein's general relativity. He argued that an electrical network wasn't just a set of wires. It was a physical space with its own topology. By tearing the system at its boundaries, he could solve each subsystem independently, as if it were a separate universe, and then use tensors to account for the interconnection energy that tied them back together.
Wait, using general relativity math for power lines? That sounds like overkill. Did his peers at General Electric think he had lost it?
Many did. Kron was a notoriously difficult character. He wasn't an educator, he was a pioneer. One of his colleagues, Charles Concordia, noted that Kron's methods were so ahead of their time that they were often met with blank stares. He famously spent years traveling through the South Pacific and Asia with nothing but a math textbook in his backpack, developing these theories in isolation. He saw a deep, almost mystical unity between rotating machines, power grids, and the fabric of spacetime. To him, tearing a system was just a way of changing the coordinate system of the problem.
If we look at this through a modern lens, dioptics sounds a lot like what we now call domain decomposition, or just parallel processing. Is he effectively the grandfather of the multi-core chip?
In a conceptual sense, yes. In the 1950s, as digital computers like the IBM 701 started appearing, Kron realized his tearing method was perfectly suited for them. Since early computers had very limited memory, they couldn't hold a massive matrix for an entire city's power grid, but they could hold the matrix for a single neighborhood. By using dioptics, you could process neighborhood A, then neighborhood B, and finally a small coordinating matrix that handled the boundaries. As Harvey Happ, one of Kron's closest collaborators, later detailed in his 1971 book, Dioptics and Networks, this wasn't just about saving memory. It was the first blueprint for distributed computing.
But there's a catch, isn't there? If I tear a problem into 10 pieces, I now have 10 solutions, but they don't know about each other. How do you handle that boundary without just recreating the original massive problem?
That's the interconnection step, and it's where the math gets heavy. Imagine you have two power companies, A and B, connected by a single high-voltage line. In diacoptics, you solve Company A and Company B as if that line doesn't exist. Then you calculate the current that would flow through that line based on the differences between the two solutions. You apply that as a correction factor. The beauty of it is that the boundary problem is usually much smaller than the original system. You've turned one impossible 1,000 by 1,000 matrix into 10 100 by 100 matrices and one small 10 by 10 link matrix. Mathematically, it's an exact solution, not an approximation.
It feels like there's a tension here between the pure math and the engineering reality. Was this actually used for anything beyond power grids?
It's spread everywhere. By the 1960s, researchers were using diacoptics to solve structural engineering problems. Think about the stresses on a skyscraper or an airplane wing. Instead of calculating the stress on every single bolt and beam at once, they'd tear the wing into sections. It was also used in early quantum chemistry to solve Schrödinger's equation for complex molecules. Even the British Tensor Club, which later became the Tensor Society of Great Britain, was founded largely to explore Kron's ideas. They saw diacoptics as a universal tool for any large-scale system, whether it was an economy or a telephone network.
So, if it was so successful, why don't we hear the word diacoptics anymore? If I go to a computer science lecture today, they'll talk about MapReduce or multi-threading, but rarely Kron.
It's a classic case of an idea being absorbed into the furniture. As computers got faster and memory got cheaper, the desperate need to tear matrices for memory reasons faded. Standard algorithms like Gaussian elimination or sparse matrix solvers became efficient enough for most tasks. But more importantly, the tensor language Kron used was incredibly dense. It was like he was speaking a dialect of math that only 5 other people understood. In the late 60s, a paper in the Electrical Journal by J. Paul Roth tried to translate Kron into more modern algebraic topology, but the jargon gap was already too wide. The parallel processing community eventually rediscovered these principles and gave them more intuitive names.
It's interesting how nomenclature can bury a legacy, but if we look at a modern GPU, which has thousands of tiny cores, Isn't that just diacoptics on a silicon scale? It's taking a giant graphics frame and tearing it into tiny patches for each core to solve simultaneously.
Exactly. The fundamental challenge today is still the boundary problem. How much do the cores need to talk to each other? If they talk too much, you lose all your speed gains to communication overhead. Kron's work in the 40s was essentially an early study of that overhead. He was trying to find the lines of tear that minimize the complexity of the interconnection. In modern terms, he was looking for the most efficient way to partition a graph. If you tear a graph where there are very few connections, the interconnection matrix is small and fast. If you tear it through a dense cluster, the coordination step becomes a bottleneck.
I want to go back to Gabriel Kron, the person, for a second. You mentioned he was not an educator. That sounds like a polite way of saying he was a bit of a rogue. How did GE handle a guy who was essentially doing mystical math while they were trying to build turbines?
GE actually gave him a surprising amount of freedom. He was part of the Analytical Engineering Division, which was basically their internal think tank. They knew his methods worked, even if they didn't fully grasp the why. There's a story that when Kron was once asked how he came up with a particular tensor solution for a complex motor, he replied that he saw the currents flowing through the geometry of the metal. He had this intense physical intuition. But that also meant he had zero patience for people who couldn't keep up. He once wrote that hard work is necessary for the mastery of any subject, and it does no good to make the way to understanding too easy. Not exactly the motto for a user-friendly textbook.
It's a bit ironic, then, that his legacy is essentially making complex things easier for computers. But let's talk about the cultural impact. Was there a sense that this tearing of problems reflected something larger in the mid-century mindset? The world was becoming more modular, more systemic.
There was definitely a systems theory movement happening. This was the era of Norbert Wiener and cybernetics. People were starting to see the world not as a collection of isolated objects, but as a web of interconnected systems. Diacoptics fit perfectly into that. It offered a way to maintain the integrity of the whole while respecting the boundaries of the parts. In Japan, for instance, diacoptics was embraced by the RAAG, the Research Association of Applied Geometry, where they used it to model everything from traffic flow to the structure of the human brain. They saw it as a philosophical bridge between the local and the global.
When we look at the controversies, though, wasn't there a pushback from the more traditional matrix crowd? People who argued that Kron was just adding unnecessary layers of complexity?
Oh, absolutely. Critics like Bill Tinney, who was a pioneer in sparse matrix methods for power systems, argued that if you just organized your data efficiently, you didn't need the fancy tiering math. There was a famous rivalry between the tierers and the sparsifiers. The sparsifiers eventually won the 1970s and 80s because their algorithms were easier to code for the computers of that era. But as we moved into the 2000s and hit the frequency wall, where we couldn't make single processors any faster, the world had to go parallel. And when you go parallel, the sparsifiers have to become tierers. You can't run a single sparse matrix solver across 1,000 cores without effectively tiering it.
So we've essentially circled back to Kron's worldview because we had no other choice. If you want to solve a big data problem today, you're doing diacoptics even if you're calling it something else.
Precisely. If you look at domain decomposition methods in modern fluid dynamics or climate modeling, the math is hauntingly similar to what Kron was writing in the Electrical Journal in 1957. We've just replaced the physical AC network analyzer with digital clusters. Even the actor model in computer science, where independent actors process bits of data and communicate only via messages, echoes the diacoptic idea of autonomous subsystems and a thin layer of coordination.
I think the big takeaway here is that tearing wasn't just a hack to save memory. It was realization about the nature of complexity. You can't understand a massive system by looking at every detail at once. You have to find the seams, pull it apart, understand the pieces, and then, critically, understand how those seams hold the whole thing together.
And that seam is where the magic happens. Kron's tensors were just a way of measuring the stress on those seams. It's a reminder that in our push for more and more cores, the real engineering challenge isn't just making the pieces faster, it's making the tearing and the stitching more elegant. We're all just living in Gabriel Kron's torn-up world now.
It's a powerful legacy for a man who started his journey walking across the Carpathian Mountains. From those peaks to the millions of transistors on a modern chip, the logic remains the same. Divide, conquer, and then find the tensor that brings it all back home.
The 1950s was a decade often remembered for white picket fences and the dawn of the space race, but beneath that surface, a group of the world's most brilliant minds was trying to build a master key for the universe. They called it cybernetics. It was a movement that claimed you could look at a guided missile, a human brain, and a national government through the exact same lens as a series of feedback loops. If you could understand the information flowing through those loops, you could theoretically control anything. It was a peak moment of scientific optimism, but it also paved the way for some of the most cold-blooded failures of the 20th century. We are looking at where this holistic systems view actually changed the world for the better and where it crashed into the messy reality of human nature.
It is hard to overstate how revolutionary this was at the time. Before cybernetics, biology was for biologists and engineering was for engineers. But after World War II, you had these legendary gatherings known as the Macy Conferences. We are talking about people like Norbert Wiener, the mathematician who basically founded the field, and anthropologists like Margaret Mead, all sitting in a room trying to find a universal language. Their big aha moment was that everything, whether it's a thermostat or a social movement, relies on feedback. You take an action, you observe the result, and you adjust. Wiener famously argued in his 1948 book, Cybernetics, that communication and control are the fundamental essences of both the animal and the machine.
The term itself, cybernetics, comes from the Greek word for steersman, right? It implies that everything is just a vessel being steered toward a goal. But there is a huge leap between steering a ship and steering a society. When these thinkers started looking at the human brain as just another biological computer, did they actually lose sight of what makes us human, or did they provide the first real map of how we think?
It was a bit of both. On the success side, the systems view is essentially why we have the modern world. The idea that the brain is a network of neurons firing in loops led directly to the birth of artificial intelligence. Frank Rosenblatt's perceptron in the late 50s was one of the first artificial neural networks, and it was a direct descendant of these cybernetic theories. It proved that you could build a machine that learns by adjusting its internal synapses based on feedback, just like a human does. Beyond tech, it transformed how we see the body. We started understanding things like homeostasis, how our body maintains a steady temperature or blood sugar as a biological feedback loop. It gave doctors a mechanical framework to understand health as a state of balance in a system.
But that mechanical framework feels like a double-edged sword. If you start viewing a person as a system of inputs and outputs, it is a very short walk to viewing a population that way. The 1950s and 60s saw this shift where governments thought they could engineer society. They applied these feedback models to the economy and even to warfare. That is where things started to get dangerous, especially when you look at the track record of systems analysis in the Pentagon.
That is the dark side of the dream. The most famous failure of this mindset is Robert McNamara and his whiz kids during the Vietnam War. McNamara came from a background of quantitative management at Ford and the Air Force, and he believed that if you had enough data, you could manage a war like a factory. He introduced systems analysis to the Department of Defense, measuring progress through body counts, sortie rates, and bombing tonnage. The logic was a classic cybernetic feedback loop. If the numbers of enemy dead go up, our strategy is working. If not, we adjust the input by sending more troops or dropping more bombs.
And the catastrophic flaw there is that a body count isn't a measure of victory. It is just a data point that ignores the political will of the enemy or the loyalty of the local population. It is what historians call the McNamara fallacy, the belief that if you can't measure it, it isn't important. They were treating the North Vietnamese as a predictable machine that would eventually reach a quote-unquote breaking point based on a mathematical formula. But people aren't machines. They don't just shut down when the math says they should.
Exactly. They mistook legibility for understanding. They built a beautiful, data-rich model of the war that had almost nothing to do with the actual reality on the ground. This is a recurring theme in the systems view failures. The model becomes more important than the territory it's supposed to represent. When the feedback loop is based on flawed metrics, the system just accelerates in the wrong direction. You see a similar, though perhaps more noble, attempt with Project Cybersyn in Chile in the early 70s.
I find CyberSyn fascinating because it was almost like a sci-fi version of socialism. They wanted to manage an entire national economy in real time using a network of telex machines and a central computer room that looked like it belonged on the bridge of the Starship Enterprise. They had these futuristic chairs with buttons in the armrests. What went wrong there? Was it just a lack of computing power, or was the theory itself fundamentally broken?
Stafford Beer, the British cyberneticist who designed it, really believed he could create a viable system that balanced central control with worker autonomy. He wanted to use feedback to prevent shortages before they happened. It actually had a moment of triumph during a major trucker strike in 1972, where the system helped the government coordinate essential supplies. But the failure was twofold. First, the technical infrastructure was incredibly fragile. They were trying to run a country on a single mainframe computer and a bunch of outdated telegram machines. But more importantly, it faced the same top-down problem. The engineers building the models weren't talking to the people on the factory floors. It became a black box where the people in the futuristic room thought they knew more than the people actually doing the work.
It sounds like the common denominator in these failures is hubris, the idea that a small group of experts can sit in a room, look at a dashboard of feedback loops, and manage the infinite complexity of human behavior. It ignores the noise of the system, which in human terms is actually the soul of the system: culture, emotions, and individual agency.
That is why the movement eventually fractured. By the late 60s, a new wave called second-order cybernetics emerged. Thinkers like Heinz von Forster pointed out a massive oversight in the original 1950s view. The observer is also part of the system. You can't just stand outside a government or a brain and tinker with it objectively. Your own biases and actions change the feedback loop. This led to a much humbler approach in fields like family therapy. Instead of a therapist trying to fix a patient like a broken machine, they started looking at the family as an interdependent emotional unit where everyone's behavior is a response to everyone else's. Murray Bowen's family systems theory is a direct legacy of this, and it's still used today because it respects the complexity of those bonds.
So we moved from trying to control the world like a machine to trying to understand how we are entangled within it. But looking at our world today, it feels like the 1950s dream of the universal feedback loop has actually come true, just through algorithms. We are constantly in these loops now. Social media feeds that adjust based on our engagement, or predictive policing models that decide where patrol cars go based on historical data. Are we just repeating the McNamara mistake on a global scale?
We absolutely are. When an algorithm prioritizes engagement as its primary feedback metric, it is doing exactly what McNamara did with body counts. It is optimizing for a number while ignoring the actual impact on the health of the system, which in this case is our social fabric. The danger of the holistic systems view is that it makes everything look manageable. It gives us the illusion of control. We think if we can just map the loops, we can solve poverty, or win a war, or make people happy. But as Nervert himself warned in his later book, The Human Use of Human Beings, we have to be careful not to outsource our moral judgment to these systems. Machines and models are literal-minded. They will follow the logic of the loop to a conclusion that might be technically correct, but humanly devastating.
It seems the real success of the systems movement wasn't trying to control the world, but giving us a way to see how interconnected we are. It taught us that you can't change one part of a system without affecting everything else. That is an invaluable lesson for ecology and medicine. But when we use it to try and steer people like we are steering a ship, we end up crashing because we forgot that the passengers have their own hands on the wheel.
The legacy of cybernetics is this constant tension between the best and the brightest trying to optimize our lives and the messy, unpredictable reality of being alive. The 1950s gave us the tools to build the digital age, but they also gave us a warning about what happens when we start treating society as a math problem. We are still living in the house that Wiener and his colleagues built, and we are still trying to figure out if we are the masters of the system or just another variable in the loop.
It is a sobering thought to realize that the same logic used to land a man on the moon was also used to justify some of the greatest tactical blunders in history. The difference seems to be whether the goal is to understand a system or to dominate it. If we have learned anything from the failures of Project CyberSyn or the WizKids, it is that no model is ever as complex as a single human life. We can use the systems view to inform our decisions, but we can't let it replace our intuition or our ethics.
That is the ultimate feedback loop we need to maintain, the one between our data and our humanity. If we lose that, we aren't steering the system anymore. We are just along for the ride. The movement for a holistic systems view succeeded in showing us the skeleton of the world, but it failed whenever it mistook that skeleton for the living, breathing reality of the people in it.
Understanding that balance between the machine and the human might be the most important steering we ever do. The idea that we can solve deep social problems by simply finding the right formula is incredibly seductive. We see it today in everything from Bayes algorithms to content moderation, but this impulse didn't start with Silicon Valley. In the 1960s, a group of technocrats believed they had found the ultimate key to human affairs through something called systems analysis. They thought that if you could just map out the variables of a complex situation, you could optimize it for the perfect outcome. It was the birth of a dream, government by data. But as we look at the growing dominance of algorithmic governance today, a haunting question emerges. Are we just repeating the catastrophic mistake of the past? Are we still trying to optimize for metrics that look good on a spreadsheet but fail miserably in the real world?
It is a striking parallel. When you look at the 1960s, the central figure in this story is Robert McNamara, who served as the U.S. Secretary of Defense. He was a product of the Harvard Business School and the whiz kids at Ford Motor Company, and he brought this intense corporate faith in quantitative management into the Pentagon. The core philosophy was that any problem, even something as messy and human as a war, could be rationalized through systems analysis. At the Rand Corporation, researchers were developing these complex models to compare alternative policies by calculating their costs and benefits. They were effectively trying to create a science of decision-making that stripped away the intuition of the general or the politician and replaced it with the cold logic of the computer.
And the ultimate proving ground for this was the Vietnam War. This is where we see the first real collapse of that dream. McNamara famously became obsessed with the body count. Since there was no traditional front line in a jungle insurgency, they decided that the metric for success would be the ratio of enemy dead to American casualties. If the numbers were high enough, they assumed, they were winning. But as a recent study in the journal Nature and several historical analyses have pointed out, this led to a massive disconnect between the data and the reality on the ground. Commanders began inflating figures to meet quotas, and the military optimized for a metric that didn't actually measure progress toward a political victory.
Exactly. This is what's now known as the McNamara fallacy, the tendency to make decisions based solely on quantitative metrics while ignoring the qualitative factors that actually matter. In Vietnam, they could count the tons of bombs dropped or the number of villages secured, but they couldn't quantify the political will of the North Vietnamese or the cultural nuances of the local population. They mistook legibility for understanding. They created a map of the conflict that was very precise, but it wasn't a map of the actual territory. And that's the danger we're facing now with algorithmic governance. We're building these incredibly sophisticated liberty machines, as the cyberneticist Stafford Beer called them, but we're still often feeding them the wrong goals.
Stafford Beer is a fascinating comparison because his work in Chile with Project CyberSyn in the early 1970s was a different kind of attempt at this. He wanted to use real-time data to manage the entire Chilean economy. Unlike McNamara's top-down approach, Beer wanted a system that would empower workers and provide decentralized coordination. It was a more democratic vision of algorithmic governance, yet it still relied on the idea that the complexities of a nation could be captured in a war room with telex machines and projectors. It makes me wonder if the problem isn't just the specific metric we choose, but the very belief that a complex human system can be managed through a technical interface at all.
That's the fundamental tension. Beer's vision was about variety engineering, the idea that to control a complex system, the controller itself must have as much variety as the system it's trying to regulate. But as the history of CyberSyn shows, and as modern critiques of big data suggest, there's a limit to how much variety a technical system can truly ingest. When we move to today's world, we see this playing out in what's called algorithmic regulation. This isn't just about government agencies using software. It's about the way algorithms now set standards and monitor behavior across society. Whether it's the reputation scores used in China or the risk assessment tools used by judges in the U.S. to determine bail, we're seeing a return to that 1960s dream of objective, data-driven decision-making.
But isn't the objective part the most dangerous illusion? We know now that algorithms aren't neutral. They're trained on historical data that often reflects deep-seated social and racial biases. In her book, Race After Technology, Ruja Benjamin describes this as the new Jim code, the way supposedly neutral technologies can actually reinforce existing hierarchies.
If a bail algorithm is optimized to predict recidivism, but it's using data from a biased policing system, then it's not really predicting crime. It's predicting future arrests in a flawed system. We're still optimizing for a metric, the risk score, that might just be as deceptive as the Vietnam body counts.
The irony is that we often adopt these systems specifically to remove human bias, yet they can end up codifying it in a way that's much harder to challenge. This brings us back to the idea of legibility. James C. Scott, in his work on how states see their citizens, argues that governments always try to make society more legible so they can manage it. Algorithms are the ultimate tool for legibility. They turn the messy, unpredictable reality of human life into a series of data points that can be processed. But in that process of simplification, we lose the context. We lose the dirty reality, as some safety researchers call it, and replace it with clean data that tells a false story.
It's a form of technological reductionism. We take a complex problem like poverty or crime and treat it as a technical puzzle to be solved with more data and better processing power. But these aren't technical problems. They're deeply political and ethical ones. When we outsource the decision-making to an algorithm, we're often abdicating our responsibility to engage with those difficult questions. It's much easier to say the algorithm said so than to defend a controversial policy choice. This creates a massive accountability gap. Who do you hold responsible when an opaque system makes a life-altering mistake?
That is a central theme in modern AI governance discussions. There's a push now for explainability and human-in-the-loop controls, but those often feel like band-aids on a deeper structural issue. The truth is that algorithmic governance often shifts power toward the people who design and control the systems, the technocrats and the private firms. This mirrors the rise of the Rand Corporation and the systems analysts in the 60s. They became a new kind of elite whose authority rested on their perceived technical expertise. Today, we have a similar class of data scientists and engineers who are effectively writing the code of our social order, often without any real democratic oversight.
And there's another layer to this, which is the sheer scale of it. In the 1960s, systems analysis was a tool for the military or large corporations. Now, it's baked into our everyday lives through algorithmic capitalism. Companies like Google and Facebook use these same principles of optimization to maximize engagement or ad revenue. As some critics point out, these algorithms have become a form of design-based governance that shapes our behavior before we even make a choice. They create a choice architecture that nudges us in specific directions. We're being optimized for the sake of a corporate bottom line, and we've seen how that can have disastrous effects on public discourse and mental health.
The parallel to the Ford Pinto case from the 1970s is quite telling here. Ford's engineers conducted a cost-benefit analysis and decided it was cheaper to pay out settlements for potential deaths than to fix a known fuel tank defect. They assigned a literal monetary value to human life to make the math work. That's a pure application of systems thinking, and it shows where that logic leads when it's untethered from human values. Today, when a social media company optimizes for engagement, even if it spreads disinformation, they're performing a similar calculation. They're optimizing for a metric that is profitable for the system, but toxic for the society it inhabits.
So if the mistake of the 1960s was the belief that everything can be quantified and optimized, how do we avoid making it again? It seems like we're just building faster, more powerful versions of the same flawed models. Is there a way to integrate data into governance without falling into the McNamara fallacy? Or is the very act of turning a human problem into a data problem always going to lead us astray?
The key might be in moving away from the idea of optimization and towards something more like discernment. We need to recognize that data can be a useful tool for observation, but it should never be a replacement for judgment. A study by the NIST on metrication errors highlights how even simple unit mix-ups, like the loss of the Mars climate orbiter because one team used metric and another used imperial units, can lead to disaster. That's a technical error, but it's also a failure of communication and coordination. In social systems, the unit errors are much more subtle and dangerous. We need to build systems that are humble, systems that acknowledge what they don't know, and that prioritize transparency and contestability over sheer efficiency.
That idea of humility in our technical systems is so important. Instead of a liberty machine that claims to have all the answers, we need tools that help us see the complexity of the world more clearly without trying to flatten it. We have to be willing to look at the heart of the conflict, as McNamara himself eventually admitted in his later years. He realized that they had viewed the world through data and missed the human dimension entirely. If we don't learn that lesson now, we're just going to keep repeating the same cycle of high-tech failure.
It's a call for a more human-centered approach to technology. We should be using algorithms to enhance our democratic processes, not to replace them. That means bringing more diverse voices into the design process and ensuring that the public has a real say in how these systems are used. We need to stop asking, how can we optimize this? And start asking, who is this system for and what values is it really serving? If we can do that, then maybe we can break the line from the systems analysis of the past to the algorithmic governance of the future and build something that actually respects the complexity of the world we live in.
It really comes down to the fact that while data can tell us a lot about where we've been, it's a poor guide for where we should go. The dream of a perfectly managed society is a recurring one, but it's always been a mirage. The more we try to force human life into the neat columns of a spreadsheet, the more we're going to find that the most important things are exactly what the data leaves out. We have to resist the urge to trade our judgment for the convenience of a metric. If we don't, we're not just repeating history, we're accelerating its most dangerous tendencies.
The challenge for the next generation of designers and policymakers is to build systems that are as nuanced and complex as the societies they serve. We can't go back to a world without algorithms, but we can demand that they be designed with a different set of priorities. We have to remember that the map is not the territory, and the dashboard is not the danger. The real world is always messier, and that's exactly why it requires our full, unmediated attention.
Ultimately, the story of 1960s systems analysis is a cautionary tale about the limits of human reason when it's divorced from human empathy. We're at a similar crossroads today, and the choices we make about how we govern through algorithms will shape the rest of the century. We can either follow the path of McNamara and optimize ourselves into another disaster, or we can choose a different way, one that uses technology to support our humanity rather than trying to replace it. The choice is ours, but we have to be conscious enough to make it.